Okay, so the last module I wanted to take a look at is the ts.CamControl module, and this is the module I put together for the interactive aspects of this patch, so for the interactive performance techniques. And what this is doing is allowing us to use our camera as a sensor to then modulate things within our max patch. So as you can see here, we've got a load of numbers at the bottom, and these correspond to average color values based on the left and the right hand side of the screen. And as I move my hand across, you can see those numbers start to change. Now, this is done using a whole host of JIT objects. So if I open up the patch and I just expand it here, I've got my webcam coming in here, being grabbed by the grab object, and it's being flipped so that it's mirrored, blah, blah, blah. And there's some other effects here that provide color variation, which I'll go into more detail because I wanted the ability to feed back and have the patch affect the video, which would then affect the patch, which would then affect the video, blah, 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 blah. But the average color data and the way that we've got it is actually quite simple. So if I open up this sub-patcher here, this vid matrix modulation, you can see here that the video is being brought in, the sample is being changed, so the resolution is being changed is probably the better way of putting that. So we're changing it to 640 by 480, then we're changing it to an 8x8 grid to then get even more kind of vague color information, and then I'm changing that again to a 2x1 grid. And what this is providing is this box here. So we have our left screen here, so if I have my hand coming in on the left, this may be more obvious with a piece of paper, for instance. So if I bring that in here, you can see that the left side of that box is changing, and if I bring it in here, you can see the right side of that box is changing. And as I do that, you can see the numbers here change as well. So using the JIT scissor object to split those up and to then unpack them into their alpha and their color values. So the way these unpacks end up coming out is the far left we have our alpha value, and then we have red, green and blue, and it's the same for both sides here. And then I'm using some smoothing here, so I'm scaling them. I'm normalizing from 0 to 255, which is standard color, digital color values, and I'm scaling that to 0 to 1, so it's a normalized value, which is just easier to work with in modulation, and we can scale that to other values as well. And then I'm using some smoothing here, so I'm using a pack F100 object, so a pack object, putting out a float over 100 milliseconds basically, and a line object to create a line between values. And what that's doing is it's basically giving me 100 milliseconds between one value and another, so it's not just jumping around and being incredibly erratic. It's a slightly more smoother. It's still quite quick, but it's slightly smoother and slightly easier to deal with. And so you can just about tell that there's 100 milliseconds as that value changes. It just makes it much easier to work with. So that's how we're getting our average color values. And then within this patch as well, as I was saying, we've got some effects happening, which we can modulate using these inlets here. And I've got it so that we need to take in a 0 to 1 value, and then it's scaled, and a 0 to 1 value, and then it's scaled. But these effects are hue angle shifts, so it's going to change the overall color of the image. So if I'm just going to close this back up so we've got a slightly nicer interface to look at. If I move this, it's going to shift to the overall color of the image in hue, thusly, so from 0 to 365 and everywhere in between, which just creates some nice color variation and just means that there's differences between each one and not too much repetition. So that's what generative is all about. We want as little repetition as possible, so we can shift that, and we're starting with a base color that's just completely different, and then we can bring stuff in and we're getting different color values basically. So yeah, we've got hue shift, and then I've got RGB splits. So if I push, so while it's in the center, we've just got our normal value, but if I push this up to the right, we start to see the red, green and blue values shift. And again, there's some smoothing there, so it doesn't happen instantly. I think it's about half a second. I've got 500 milliseconds, so I change that value and it shifts, and then I'll change it in the opposite direction and it shifts in the opposite direction. And again, this is just providing a bit of color variation. And also, if we want to use this for projection, we can have audio affect this and have it as a glitching effect, basically. So we can modulate the speed at which this happens and the extent to which this happens, and create some really interesting video effects as well, based on the music, which is being influenced by the video, which is being influenced by the music, and so on and so forth. So yeah, if I just kind of show you some real world use case of this, I'm not going to start the audio again because my computer does sound like it's about to take off from the screen recording and from the amount of processing that we've got going on here, but we shouldn't need to, so that's fine. So I've got different inlets on my multi-tap delay here. So I've got parameter mod, -30 to +30. So I need to scale my output here, and I actually need to scale it slightly differently to what I've currently put in. So if I scale that from 0 to 1 to -30 to +30, like this, and I patch these, well, let's just go for 1. I don't know why I've selected 3, I got a little bit too excited. So if I delete those, so what we're using is the red value of the left hand side of the screen here. So as I move something in here, we can see those parameters start to change. And this, in the wider patch, I have hooked up to multiple things. I have it hooked up to the tap delay in this, like I do here. I have it hooked up to fade between presets on Spindrift and on rings, and I believe, off the top of my head, on the filter as well. So it's just a really interesting way of creating some interaction. And if you couple this with a microphone coming into the sample, for instance, and we can hit stuff, as I was saying earlier, you have a few different ways that you can interact with what is otherwise a completely self-contained and generative patch. There we go. And this was a big learning curve, and trying to work out how to use jitter. I've never used jitter before. So, but again, it's kind of that concept of we find a way of getting the data, and then we find a way of using the data. And this is one particularly interesting way of just creating some really odd shifts. In fact, let's try it. Go on, let's try it. Let's see if it dies. Let's see if the computer can handle it. So let's bring the audio up. Bring the audio up. I'm getting my delay in. To a level that isn't going to deafen. We get some nice twitchy modulation. Okay. So those are some of the core modules that I have within this wider patch. I mean, there's a lot more going on. There's a Euclidean sequencer, there's some logic gates, there's other sound sources, there's filtering, there's a mixer, and the convolution unit. But those are some of the more complex and more bespoke objects and modules that I've built for this. And as I said, the idea is to replicate modular generative techniques, and to replicate that whole workflow, and what is so exciting and so invigorating about modular within software as much as possible. I do plan to add some extra stuff. As I said, I plan to develop this further, so I want to add some spatiality to this. I want to add some sort of tactile control, whether that's Touch OSC or some sort of custom MIDI controller, or even stuff with contact microphones and that sort of thing. So it's a starting point, and I think it's quite a complex and interesting starting point. But yeah, thank you for watching. Cheers.